Some football tragedies are so haunting that even decades later, you can't quite believe they happened in a stadium, like when Liverpool fans crushed behind steel fences at Hillsborough, or when Juventus supporters lost their lives before the European Cup final at Heysel, or even that plane crash that nearly wiped out Manchester United. And those are just a few. Because in Lima, in 1964, one match became the deadliest in football history: the Estadio Nacional disaster. You ever heard a story so tragic that you can't wrap your head around how it even happened at a football match? That's Lima in 1964, Peru versus Argentina. This was a qualifying match for the Tokyo Olympics that should have been a celebration of football, but turned into pure chaos. The scoreline was tight, the tension was thicker than humid air, and then came the call that flipped the whole stadium on its head: an equalizer from Peru that was ruled out by the referee. The crowd didn't take it as just a bad decision. It was like someone had lit a match in a room full of petrol fumes. Fans stormed the pitch, police came in swinging batons, and the next thing, there was tear gas in a stadium with locked gates. People tried to run, but there was nowhere to go, and it became a stampede, a wave of bodies piling against each other. By the time the chaos stopped, 328 people were dead. 328. That's entire neighborhoods wiped out in one night, all because of one disallowed goal and the madness that followed. If you think VAR decisions cause meltdowns now, imagine that level of anger and panic in a place with no real crowd safety measures. It was a disaster that scarred Peruvian football forever and changed how the world looked at stadium security. And sadly, this wasn't the only time football's biggest gatherings ended with tragedy. The Hillsborough disaster. Hillsborough wasn't a fight or a riot or some kind of fan clash. It was just people who showed up to watch football and never got the chance to go home. It was the FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. The match was set in Sheffield at Hillsborough, with Liverpool fans crammed into the smaller Leppings Lane end. Combine that with shoddy planning, heavy-handed policing, and an old-school terrace boxed in by high fences, and you have the perfect recipe for disaster. Crowds kept building up outside before kickoff, and instead of delaying the match, the police opened a main gate to relieve the pressure outside. But that just meant a surge of fans packed into an already crammed section behind the goal. With no way out, steel fences in front of them, and a wall of bodies pressing from behind, it became a cage, and the human body can't handle that kind of pressure for more than a few minutes. People were suffocating while the match carried on in front of them, and then, as if the grief wasn't enough, the media piled on with lies and started pinning the blame on hooliganism and dragging the victims' names through the mud. It took decades for the truth to be officially recognized, that the fault was with the police and poor stadium management. And even then, the 97 lives gone. And if you rewind a few years before that, Europe had already seen one of its ugliest nights, at the Heysel Stadium in Brussels. Have you ever watched two massive clubs go head-to-head and feel the tension before a ball's even kicked? Now picture that tension turning into outright violence. The match was between Juventus and Liverpool at the European Cup final in Brussels in 1985. Where it all started was that the fans were in mixed sections. Then the stadium was old and crumbling, and there was barely any security separating rival supporters. Before kickoff, Liverpool fans charged toward the Juventus end. People panicked and pushed back as far as they could, but the wall behind them wasn't built to take that kind of pressure, so it collapsed, and the fall crushed people and trapped others underneath. 39 fans, mostly Juventus supporters, died that night, and hundreds more were injured. And here's the thing. The match still went ahead. Imagine the players walking onto the pitch knowing there were bodies being carried away outside the tunnel. UEFA said it was to avoid more violence if they canceled, but it's hard to imagine football mattering at that point. The fallout was massive, and English clubs were banned from European competitions for 5 years, but Liverpool got 6. Heysel was painted as a turning point in cracking down on hooligan culture, but for the families of the victims, it wasn't about football politics. It was about losing loved ones in a place they'd gone for joy. And in England itself, that same year, another disaster would prove that sometimes danger doesn't come from violence, it can come from something as simple as a dropped match. Bradford City Stadium fire. If you've ever seen footage of this, you know how haunting it is. Bradford City had just been promoted to the second division, it was the last home game of the season, the sun was out, fans were celebrating, and then, in under 5 minutes, an entire stand was an inferno. It started small with smoke rising from under the wooden seats, but most people thought it was just a flare or some harmless little fire that would be stomped out. But the stand was ancient. It was built in 1911. With years of rubbish and paper piled up underneath, a dropped cigarette or match was all it took. The fire spread so fast that some fans barely had time to react before the flames were above their heads. People ran onto the pitch, but others were trapped trying to get through narrow exits. That day, 56 people lost their lives, and over 260 were injured. The most brutal part is how quickly it all happened, because from the first sign of smoke to the roof collapsing was just minutes. This disaster led to strict fire safety regulations in UK stadiums, but it's chilling to think how many grounds back then were ticking time bombs. The Puerta 12 tragedy, River Plate versus Boca Juniors. You don't need me to tell you that fixture already carries enough chaos on its own, but in 1968, the drama wasn't on the pitch. It was in the stands, and more specifically at Gate 12 of El Monumental. After the final whistle, thousands of fans headed for the exit, but for some reason that's still not fully clear. Gate 12 was either locked or nearly impossible to open. The crowd behind kept moving forward, not realizing what was happening at the front, and it turned into a deadly stampede in the stairwell. People were pinned so tight against each other they couldn't move their arms, couldn't breathe. 71 people died, with many of them being teenagers. In the aftermath, theories flew around. Some blamed police for closing the gate, while others said it was a turnstile issue, but no one was ever officially held responsible. That's what makes it even more bitter for the families. There was no justice, no closure. The rivalry between River and Boca still burns today, but this match is a dark shadow over it. And just like in Buenos Aires, another tragedy in Ghana decades later would show that when panic meets poor crowd control, the results can be just as deadly. The Accra Sports Stadium disaster. If you are a fan of Ghanaian football, you know that Accra Hearts of Oak versus Asante Kotoko was the rivalry. The stadium was packed, the match was tense, and Hearts of Oak scored late, but Kotoko fans weren't having it. In a matter of minutes, bottles started flying onto the pitch. The police moved in, and here's where it went horribly wrong. Instead of calming things down, they fired tear gas into the stands. If you've never been in a crowd surge or seen one, it's impossible to really explain that panic. People don't think, they just run. So, thousands tried to get out at once, but the exits couldn't handle it. Within minutes, 126 fans were dead. The worst part is that a government inquiry found most deaths were from asphyxiation, not the chaos itself, meaning if the tear gas hadn't been used, many would have lived. It's one of those disasters that wasn't just tragic, it was avoidable. And sadly, that's a pattern we've seen before. Like in Moscow, where panic in freezing weather led to one of the most disputed death tolls in football history. The Luzhniki Stadium disaster. You've probably never heard much about this one, because for years, almost nobody outside the USSR did. It happened at a UEFA Cup match between Spartak Moscow and HFC Harlem. It was freezing, snow was everywhere, and the game was nearly over. Spartak scored late, and fans started to leave early to beat the cold. Then Spartak scored again, and some tried to turn back to celebrate, but on a narrow stairway. That was a disaster waiting to happen. First, people slipped, others fell on top of them, and the whole thing turned into a human pileup. Officially, the Soviet government said 66 people died, but survivors have always claimed it was much higher. Some say more than 300. In those days, information was tightly controlled, so the real number might never be known. What makes it scary is how silent it was kept. There were no big memorials. Families just had to grieve quietly while the rest of the football world barely knew anything had happened. And while Luzhniki was hidden from the world, in Egypt a decade earlier, another disaster played out in broad daylight. The Zamalek Stadium stampede. This one doesn't get talked about much, but it's as haunting as any other. Zamalek was playing in a match that had been moved to a smaller stadium. The thing is, thousands of fans either didn't know or didn't care, but they showed up anyway. When word spread that people were being turned away, crowds tried to force their way in. The structure couldn't handle that many people pushing forward, so the stands collapsed, people were trampled, and somewhere between 48 and 50 fans died, while others were badly injured. The craziest part is this wasn't in the middle of some chaotic derby. It was just a regular match with poor planning and no crowd control. But it proves the same point as so many of these stories. In football, it only takes one moment of bad organization to turn excitement into disaster. The Chapecoense plane crash. This one still hits hard because it wasn't just about football, it was about an entire city losing its heroes in one night. Chapecoense was this small Brazilian club who'd made a fairy tale run to the Copa Sudamericana final, and they were flying to Colombia for the first leg against Atlético Nacional. Well, the plane never made it. It ran out of fuel just before landing and crashed into a hillside near Medellin, and 71 people died, including players, coaching staff, journalists, and crew. Only 6 survived, and the crash was later found to be the result of poor planning by the airline, which makes it even more devastating. The images in the days after were unreal. The wreckage in the mountains, the empty dressing room, and the green ribbons and tributes from clubs all over the world. Atlético Nacional even requested that Chapecoense be awarded the title. It was one of those moments where football's rivalries didn't matter. The whole sport grieved together. And while Chapecoense was a modern tragedy, let's talk about one of football's earliest disasters. Munich Air disaster. Manchester United in the 50s was building something special under Matt Busby, a young, fearless squad known as the Busby Babes. They'd just beaten Red Star Belgrade and were flying home with a refueling stop in Munich. It was snowing. The runway was icy, and after 2 failed takeoff attempts, they tried a third. But the plane didn't make it. It skidded, crashed through a fence, and was torn apart. 23 people died, including 8 United players and 3 club staff. Survivors like Bobby Charlton and Matt Busby himself carried those scars, physically and emotionally, for the rest of their lives. United was nearly wiped out that day. But somehow, they rebuilt. 10 years later, they won the European Cup, which was a tribute to those they'd lost. The Munich disaster became a part of the club's identity, not in a glory-hunting way, but in a deeply human way, a reminder of how quickly everything can change. Football's magic lies in the way it brings people together, but these stories are the painful reminder that it can also tear entire communities apart in a single moment. Every goal, every roar, and every packed stand carries a responsibility for safety that should never be ignored. If you've learned something new today, share it so these tragedies are never forgotten. And if you want more untold football stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and be here for the next one.